In Lesson 6.05, The War Begins in U.S. History, Part A, you're going to be learning about basically the first year of the Civil War. It starts in the spring of 1861 and talks about the initial months when the Confederacy was separate and the states were seceding from the Union, but they were not yet at war, and how the war actually began. Then it's going to go into talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the North and the South at the start of the war, and then on to talk about the first year of war itself. So you can see these topics outlined for you in the goals of the lesson. You want to be able, when you finish this lesson, to describe Lincoln's strategy and reasons for keeping the border states in the Union. Border states refer to states like Maryland that were right on the border between the North and the South, and it refers to his strategy to keep them there, um, basically for the safety of not only the nation's capital, but to keep them there as far as the safety between, as a buffer between the Confederacy and the Union. We want to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the North and the South at the start of the war and summarize the progress of the war in its first year. The pages you're going to be reading are pages 408 to 418 in your textbook. If you don't have the physical hard copy of the textbook, you can always access the online version, which is up here under Course Home. If you click on the American Odyssey textbook PDF, you'll find the electronic version there. On the third slide, you see the reading guide. Please make sure that you print this off for this lesson and take notes on it directly while you are reading these textbook pages. Now let's take a look at the textbook pages itself. The first two pages are the timeline. Remember, at the start of each chapter there is a timeline, and you might find this effective as a snapshot to take a quick look at the events and kind of give yourself a visual of what's going on. We're focusing on the time period from 1860 to 1865. So the Civil War, it did last for about 5 years, and you're going to focus on the key events there. So it gives you a little bit of a visual of the time frame you'll be discussing. Now, in the beginning of the chapter, they always kind of set the stage and tell you a little bit about where the situation is, where you're starting in the timeline. And it starts talking about the secession of South Carolina from the Union after Lincoln had been inaugurated. Okay. And it talks a little bit about how long the war was, how many lives it would cost. It's just giving you an overview of the Civil War itself. Now, secession and response is all about how the South did secede from the Union. It started with South Carolina, and then rapidly four other states would follow. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina would follow in its wake and form the Confederacy. So in this portion, we're going to find out what happens when the states do start to secede, and there is a conflict that begins at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So not only does South Carolina become the first state to secede, but they're also the location. Fort Sumter was off of the coastline of South Carolina, so it is also the location of where the war begins. We're going to take a look at the statistics comparing the strength. How did the North and South compare when it came to population? What about what they produced, or their ability to produce goods in industry? Okay, or their machinery? How much did they have on them? What did they own as far as being able to produce goods? How about total miles of railroad or farmland? To be able to wage a war successfully, you have to be able to feed it or fuel it with people, with goods, with food, and to have transportation to keep your soldiers supplied. So all of these things were very, very important. If you look at the resources of the North and the South in 1861 and compare the green portion of this to the blue portion, which is the North, you can see that overwhelmingly the North had the advantage in many areas as far as resources would go. But that didn't mean that the North held every advantage. The South was also fighting to defend itself. to defend its territory, because largely the war would be a war of invasion, the North trying to subdue or bring the South back into the Union and preserve that Union. So the South had a sense of protecting itself. It also had its sense of honor and duty to maintain their way of life. They felt they were being invaded and unjustly ruled. Many in the South saw it as a second war of independence as Americans. So it was very, very important to them, and they did have the home advantage in most of the battles that occurred in the war. Most of the battles in the Civil War occurred in the South. The first Bull Run was the first major military engagement of the war, and this was a very important war because at the time people still thought that this was going to be over quickly and with relatively little bloodshed. It was still, the honorable part of war, the dashing and the daring part of war, men going off to war in uniform, very romantic and heroic notion. But as even Abraham Lincoln would see, the destruction and the defeat for Union troops at Bull Run basically shocked the nation into realizing that this might not be over as quickly as they thought. Even Lincoln thought the Battle of Bull Run would be a war. They would beat the Confederacy and they would understand that they had to come back into the Union, but that was definitely not the case. Okay. Now they talk about up here with Scott's Great Snake. Up here talks about the Anaconda Plan, and the Anaconda Plan was a military strategy that the Union had to seal off the coastline of the Confederacy, make sure that they could not get in supplies. Now remember that the South was really reliant on agriculture. They didn't make a lot of their own manufactured goods. In fact, they didn't have as much manufacturing or railroads as the North did. So as a result of this, it became very apparent that the advantage the North had would be to win the war by choking off their supply line. Now also, if you notice, this western side of the snake, or the left hand side of the snake line here, is basically around the area of the Mississippi. And if the Mississippi was choked off or controlled by the Union, that meant that they could dominate another source of transportation, or another source of moving goods throughout the South. So this was the predominant plan that was created by General Winfield Scott in order to choke off and blockade the Confederacy. Now, as part of this blockade, a very famous battle would occur between the Merrimack and the Monitor. Okay, very famous clash between those two ships. They were known as ironclads because they had iron sides to them. And they were basically armored, so they were like the first version of a armored ship or a steel ship. So this is one of the reasons why the war was called one of the first modern wars. Lots of different technology emerged during the war. So it was a clash between the first ironclad warships, the Union's Monitor and the Confederacy's Merrimack. It was actually renamed the Virginia. The Merrimack was a captured ship, a captured Union ship that the Confederacy turned into their own ironclad. These two ships fought each other. Cannonballs bounced off of each other for a long while, and there wasn't really a very clear victor there. But it was a very intense display of what technology could do and how war was advancing. Okay. So Grant, we finally get to Ulysses S. Grant, one of the most famous generals in the Civil War. Grant was primarily, early on in the war, involved with military operations in the West. He was not militarily operating near Washington, D.C., or towards where General Lee of the Confederacy, where his battles were taking place. But Grant would very quickly establish a name for himself in the West, moving quickly, fighting quickly and efficiently, unlike General McClellan in the East, who was commander of the army twice under Lincoln's command, who moved very slowly and tended not to follow up with his military movements. So Grant's victories in the West won him a lot of positive favor. Two big victories for the Union in the West were Shiloh and New Orleans. Now, Grant was responsible for winning the Battle of Shiloh, but it was so destructive on both sides. So many men lost their lives. It became very obvious to Grant during this time period that the Union would not be able to win the war against the South unless they engaged in total warfare, meaning basically burning down or burning their crops, totally eliminating any supplies, taking all and any prisoners that they could, and just basically doing everything they could to make sure they couldn't supply a war. That's actually how the idea where General Sherman developed this idea of total warfare in cutting a path across the South as he moved towards Atlanta. That will come later in the war. Your reading actually kind of closes up here at the bottom of this page, 418. So the Peninsula Campaign and the Second Bull Run will be where we pick up in the next lesson. So when you come back to your lesson after reading the textbook pages and completing the reading guide, you do have an online activity that you can complete here, and it will walk you through the battles of the first year of the Civil War. So if, for example, you can click on the flashing icon and it will give you information about that battle, but you do have to fill some information in. This first one asks about the naval blockade at Hampton Roads. Although there was no conclusive winner, this Virginia battle involved two ironclads, and as we saw earlier in this instructional video, we know that that was actually the Merrimack and the Monitor. Okay, so your two ironclads that were involved there were the Merrimack and the Monitor. Norfolk was eventually captured by General McClellan on May 11th, 1862. So basically, and I actually, as you can see here, you can check your responses. I spelled Merrimack wrong. I forgot. It was actually with an M-A-C there. Okay, so as you do this, you can go through each battle, the major battle of the first year of the war. Okay, we also see the Battle of Bull Run, and you continue through the exercise in that manner. Okay, when you get to the fourth slide here, it will talk to you about this particular activity sheet inside the Civil War. You can print off this activity sheet, and it will give you a series of questions about Sullivan below. And this was a Union soldier who left a letter to his wife before he died in the Civil War. He never got to mail it. So when you check out this website here, you'll find information about Sullivan below and his letter to his wife. You can answer those questions and get practice working with what is a primary document. This is a primary document because it is a letter from a person during the time period that we're studying. This is not a secondary source. A secondary source would maybe be a collection of letters from the Civil War edited by a modern day historian giving his impression on those letters. That would be a secondary resource. Okay. Don't forget, for this particular lesson, you will see a checkpoint listed, but I have removed this checkpoint from your grade book. Okay, so you will not have that. It's showing on my view here, but I've hidden that from your view, as you can see there in the little tagline. Okay, so you don't have a checkpoint for this one. Just make sure that you finish your reading and you have completed your reading guide for reference on your next quiz, which will be quiz 6.09. It's a big one, so make sure not to skimp on your efforts here and be sure to complete your reading guide. If you have any questions on lesson 6.05, as always, make sure to contact me. I'll be happy to help. Good luck.